So let's look at solving quadratic equations. This is something you've probably done before in previous math class, but I think it's good if we've got a video where we can kind of look at all the techniques fairly quickly. Solving quadratics is something that we should get pretty good at, and we should be able to do pretty quickly because it's going to come up over and over and over and over again throughout the course here. So let's look at some different methods for solving quadratics. The first one is factoring. We can use a calculator to help us, or you'll probably get pretty good at doing it without a calculator. So we'll look at both methods. Basic algebra techniques, you see what that means in a little bit, but it's basically there's certain types of quadratic equations where we don't have to use factoring in kind of the traditional sense, which you might think. And then the quadratic formula. I actually don't have a quadratic formula example on this because most of what we'll be handling is can be handled through factoring or using a calculator to find the zeros if we're not factoring. So we're not going to use the quadratic formula a lot. You've had it before. If you want to use it, I absolutely encourage you to use it. It's beautiful and wonderful and fun. So let's get started. Factoring without a calculator. So basically, factoring means we're going to take this quadratic and we're going to take the one equation, x squared plus 3x minus 4, and we're going to split it into two expressions. Oh, two expressions, okay? And so basically all this means is that we're going to break it up so that instead of having one expression equal to 0, we end up with 2. And I'll show you why this is helpful in a little bit. X squared plus 3x minus 4. Well, if I'm trying to factor this thing, I know that my first term must be x. And the coefficient on that x has to be 1 because my coefficient right here is 1. All right, so we're trying to solve this equation and figure out what x is. Factoring, this is the technique we're going to use. Now, I look at the last term there in the expression, negative 4. And I ask myself, well, what numbers multiply to give me 4, but combine to give me a positive 3? Well, so I think about multiples of, factors of 4. Well, I've got 1 and 4, and I've got 2 and 2. Well, 4 and 1, I think I can combine those things to give me 3. Okay, so let's look at 1 and 4. So I'm going to put a 1 in here and a 4 in here, and you'll see it doesn't really matter where we put the 1 and the 4. What matters is where we put the sign. So the question is, do I have a negative 1 or a positive 1, and a negative 4 or a positive 4? Well, I know that it's got to be plus minus or minus plus because I have a negative 4. A negative times a positive gives me a negative. So, and I notice that I've got a positive 3 right here, right? This is a positive 3. And that means that I must have a positive 4 and a negative 1 because positive 4 minus 1 is positive 3. Let's double check our answer real quick. If I FOILed this out, I would get x squared plus 4x minus x minus 4 equals 0, and I think that's what we started with. So now let's actually go find the solutions, and we're going to rely on this principle that says if I make this side 0, this part 0, so if I make x minus 1 0, then that will make the entire equation 0. So the question is, what is x equal to make that part 0? Well, that happens when x minus 1 is 0 or when x equals 1. So that's one of my solutions. When x plus 4 equals 0, that must be when x equals negative 4. That's another one of my solutions. Notice if I plug in 1 here, I get 1 minus 1 is 0 times anything is 0. And the same for x equals negative 4. So that's the basic, without using a calculator to help us, to solve a quadratic. Let's go on to the next one. Factoring with a calculator. So this one is not set equal to 0. You notice in the previous one we were already set equal to 0. You'll always want to almost always want to set these equal to 0 first. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides. I'm going to add 5 over here and add 5 over here. So I get x squared minus 6x plus 5 equals 0. Now I'm going to use my calculator to help me. So I'm going to plug into the y equals, I'm going to plug in this part right here, and I'm going to look for the zeros when this is set equal to 0. We learned recently that that's one technique for solving equations. So let's look at this in using a graphing calculator here, and you can see if we zoom in, I've got the function graphed. It crosses at x equals 1 and x equals 5. And so if the question is asking you what are the solutions to this quadratic, you're done. The zeros are x equals 1 and x equals 5. Now if it's asking you, hey, can you factor this? Okay, well, we can still use what we know here to help us factor it, and I'll show you how. When I'm thinking about, ignore this for right now, I'm thinking about factoring this equation. I'm going to split it into two parts, right? And this is set equal to 0, so I'm kind of running into my x equals 1 there. I know that I'm going to have two factors, and it's going to come from these zeros. So, sorry, I'll kind of try and split those up. But to set this equation on top here equal to 0, I'm just going to subtract 1 from both sides. So minus 1, minus 1, so I get x minus 1 equals 0. Boom, that's one of my factors. So I'm going to write that down, x minus 1. Same thing for x equals 5. X minus 5 must be one of my factors. It's important that you make sure you understand the difference between a factor, x minus 5, x minus 1, and a solution, x equals 1, x equals 5. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. 3x squared equals x plus 10. Well, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to set this equal to 0, and in fact, I'm sure that you can do that. If you set it equal to 0, you end up with this equation right here, which is 3x squared minus x minus 10. All right, and if we zoom out just a little bit so we can actually see the zeros here, we notice that the zeros are not as nice as the previous example. So we've got 1 0 here at x equals 2, and this is at x equals, we can go figure it out. You could figure it out on your calculator, but it's at x equals negative 1.6 repeating. All right, now x equals 2, we can use that technique from before. So once again, if they're asking for you to find the solutions, we're done. We found the solutions. If they're asking for you to factor, we're going to use the solutions to help us factor. So piggybacking off of the technique we used last time, I'm going to factor, ignoring the top equation, I'm going to factor the bottom into, notice x equals 2, so one of my factors must be x minus 2, and then another factor must be, now this is the problematic piece right here, because I don't want to put in x plus 1.66. Not cool. All right, we just want to use integer coefficients when we factor. So I know that if I use x as my first term here, then I must have a 3x right here. That's got to be 3x. All right, so the question is, because 3 times 1x is 3x, so the question is, what factors give me a negative 10 for that last term? And I've already got the negative 2, so what times negative 2 gives me a negative 10? Well, that's a positive 5. Okay, so my factor is 3x plus 5 times x minus 2. Okay, so that's one way you can use the calculator for a more complicated problem with a leading coefficient that is not 1. Okay, so let's go on to the last one here, using algebra techniques. So this one, we don't have to graph or anything. If it's already a perfect square, and there's a couple other things we'll talk about in class, we can just use algebra techniques and where we basically try to isolate the x. And I'll show you how. The first thing we want to do is get the quadratic piece by itself. So I'm going to divide by 2, and I'll get x plus 4 squared equals 3. Okay, and so then I'll take the square root of both sides. Okay, so x plus 4 equals the square root of 3. Excuse me, this should be the plus or minus, right? Whenever we take the square root of a variable, so this is plus or minus, and then I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. So I'll get x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 3. Now those would be really ugly solutions if you graphed it, but this is the exact solution, which is generally what we're going for. Notice this is two solutions, right? Negative 4 plus square root of 3, negative 4 minus the square root of 3. All right, so those are a few techniques to help you solve quadratic equations.